Medieval knights, glory, blood, and secrets. Medieval Europe was not a peaceful world. It was a land carved by steel, ruled by fear, and protected by men who were trained from childhood to kill or be killed. In this world, the knight was not just a warrior. He was an idea. A symbol of power, loyalty, and destruction wrapped in honor. A boy destined to become a knight did not grow up like ordinary children. From a very early age, often as young as 7, he was taken away from his home. Not because he was unwanted, but because he was chosen. Chosen to become something greater than a farmer, greater than a merchant, greater than a common soldier. He was to become a weapon shaped by discipline. He began as a page. In the castles of lords and nobles, he learned silence before speech. He learned obedience before thought. He carried messages through cold stone halls, polished armor until it reflected his own tired face, and watched older knights prepare for war, as if it were a sacred ritual. But beneath the surface of honor, there was harshness. Pages were not treated gently. They were tested constantly. Hunger was part of their training. Exhaustion was normal. Fear was common. Because a knight who could not endure pain was already dead in the battlefield. As the boy grew older, he became a squire. This was not an easy promotion. It was a deeper descent into the world of violence. Now he served a single knight, following him into battles, watching him kill, watching him bleed, and learning that war was not glorious in reality. It was loud, chaotic, and merciless. The squire cleaned blood from swords. He stitched wounds that sometimes never healed properly. He carried heavy armor across muddy fields after battles where the dead were too many to count. In every moment he was being observed. His master was not only a warrior, but also a judge. Every action of the squire was a test. Knighthood was not given. It was earned through suffering. But what made knights different from ordinary soldiers was not just training. It was belief. The church played a powerful role in shaping the knight's identity. Before becoming a knight, a man would go through a sacred ritual. He would fast, pray, and confess every sin he had ever committed. He would spend a night in silence, often standing beside his sword, as if waiting for God himself to decide whether he was worthy. Then came the ceremony. In front of nobles, priests, and warriors, the squire would kneel. A sword would be placed on his shoulder. A final strike, not of violence but of symbolism, would mark his transformation. From that moment, he was no longer just a man. He was a knight of Christendom, bound by honor, loyalty, and war. But history hides a truth beneath this ceremony. Knights were not always noble. Many were driven by ambition rather than honor. Many served kings who cared more for land than justice. Many fought wars not for faith, but for gold, land, and revenge. The shining armor was often polished to hide the dirt of reality, and yet the world needed them, because the medieval world was violent beyond imagination. Villages were burned in territorial disputes. Roads were unsafe. Bandits ruled forests. Kings fought endless wars for thrones that changed hands like coins in a market. In this chaos, the knight became both protector and predator. He could save a village from destruction in one moment and burn another in the next, depending on who he served. And this contradiction is what made knights both feared and respected across Europe. As time moved forward, the knight became more than just a soldier. He became part of a code, what later generations called chivalry. honor, courage, loyalty, mercy to the weak. These were the ideals written in songs and stories. But in real battlefields, chivalry often collapsed under the weight of survival. A knight charging into battle did not think about poetry. He thought about impact, about the weight of his lance, about the enemy in front of him, about whether he would live long enough to see tomorrow. And when steel met steel, when horses screamed and men fell into mud mixed with blood, the truth of medieval warfare revealed itself. There was no glory in pain, only endurance. Yet despite everything, the legend of the knight grew stronger with time. Because people do not remember only the brutality, they remember the image. An armored rider on horseback, standing against chaos, sword raised like a promise of order. As Europe moved deeper into the medieval era, the idea of the knight stopped being only a local force of a lord's army. It became something far larger, something tied to religion, politics, and continents, away from home. War was no longer just about land between neighboring kingdoms. It became a mission believed to be sacred. And this is where the Crusades began to reshape the identity of knighthood forever. The word crusade carried the weight of faith and violence at the same time. For many knights, it was presented not as war, but as pilgrimage with a sword. The promise was simple in message, but terrifying in reality. Fight in the name of God, and your sins would be forgiven. For a world where religion shaped every thought of life and death, this promise was powerful enough to move thousands of armored men across continents. Kings, nobles, peasants, and knights all answered the call in different ways, but the knight class became the sharpest blade of this movement. They were trained for war, already bound by loyalty, and already conditioned to believe that violence could be righteous when sanctioned by heaven. The First Crusade opened a path into the unknown. Armies moved towards the Holy Land, driven by belief, ambition, and the hunger for land and glory. But what they found was not a simple battlefield of good versus evil. It was a complex world of cities, cultures, and civilizations far older and more advanced than many of the European warriors had ever imagined. Still, the knight advanced. Steel was their language. Armor was their identity. Faith was their shield. But the Crusades did not only create battles. They created orders, brotherhoods of knights who no longer served only a king, but served a cause that claimed to be eternal. Among these orders, one name would rise above all others in mystery, power, and legend: the Knights Templar. The Templars were not ordinary knights. They were warriors bound by vows that went beyond the battlefield. They swore poverty, obedience, and loyalty, not to a kingdom, but to their order. On paper, they rejected wealth and personal power. In reality, they would become one of the most powerful organizations of the medieval world. At first, their mission was simple: protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Roads were dangerous, filled with bandits, shifting alliances, and constant war. The Templars became guardians of those fragile routes. A pilgrim who once walked in fear could now travel with the hope that armored knights of the order might appear if danger came. But protection slowly transformed into power. The Templars built fortresses across strategic locations. They established networks that stretched from Europe to the Middle East. And over time, they developed something even more dangerous than swords: trust. Kings and nobles began to trust them with money, land, and political influence. The order that once owned almost nothing began to control vast resources across kingdoms. And with power, too, came suspicion. Because in the medieval world, power that could not be controlled was always feared. Alongside the Templars, other knightly orders rose as well, each tied to the idea of holy war. The Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, each order carried its own identity, its own mission, and its own version of loyalty to faith and empire, but they all shared one truth. They were no longer just warriors. They were institutions of war. As the Crusades continued, the reality of battle became darker than the stories told in Europe. The Holy Land was not a symbolic battlefield. It was a place of constant siege, shifting control, and brutal endurance. Cities changed hands through bloodshed. Armies marched through deserts where water was more valuable than gold. Knights who had once dreamed of glory faced exhaustion, disease, and enemies who fought with equal strength and determination. The myth of clean, honorable warfare began to collapse. In one moment, knights charged in formations that looked almost disciplined, almost noble in their structure. In the next, those formations shattered under ambush, heat, exhaustion, and chaos. Horses fell. Armor became a burden under the sun. Steel, once a symbol of power, became heavy in the wrong climate. And yet the wars continued, because the idea behind them was stronger than the reality of suffering. Back in Europe, stories of the Crusades returned like echoes, some exaggerated, some glorified, some silent about the horrors. Knights were praised as heroes who fought for Christendom. Songs were written about their courage, but those who returned often carried something different within them. Some returned silent, changed by what they had seen. Others returned powerful, enriched by spoils and status. And many never returned at all. Within this chaos, knightly orders became even more complex. They were no longer just military groups. They were political players. They influenced kings. They controlled trade routes. They managed wealth that rivaled entire kingdoms. And this created a dangerous imbalance in medieval society. Because when warriors become bankers, diplomats, and landowners at the same time, they stop being simple soldiers. They become something far harder to control. And that is when fear begins to grow. Whispers started to spread across Europe. Questions began to form. Why were the Templars so rich? Why did they answer only to the Pope and not to kings? What secrets did they carry behind their vows of silence and obedience? In the shadows of castles and courts, suspicion grew like a slow poison. But during the height of the Crusades, none of this mattered to the knights on the battlefield. For them, survival was immediate. Duty was constant. And faith, whether questioned or not, remained the force that pushed them forward into war after war. As generations of knights passed through the Holy Land, the meaning of knighthood itself began to shift. It was no longer just about defending a lord or a village. It was about belonging to a global conflict that stretched across continents, religions, and centuries. And slowly the image of the knight began to split into two realities. One was the legend, noble warriors of honor, shining armor, divine purpose. The other was the truth. Exhausted men trapped in endless cycles of war, politics, and ambition. But history remembers both. And the Crusades ensured that the knight would never again be seen as just a local warrior. He had become a symbol of a world in conflict between faith and power, between glory and blood, between what was believed and what was real. And as the Crusades moved toward their later chapters, something even more dangerous began to form beneath the surface of Europe. A silence, a tension, and a question that no sword could answer. When the Crusades began to slow, and the battlefield in the Holy Land stopped feeling like an endless victory march, the knightly orders did not fade away. Instead, they changed shape. What once was open war became quiet influence. What once was survival became politics. And what once was faith became suspicion. Across Europe and the remnants of Crusader states, the knightly orders that had been born in fire now lived in complexity. The Knights Templar was no longer just a brotherhood of warriors protecting pilgrims. It had become a network stretching across kingdoms, controlling land, resources, and financial systems that even kings began to depend on. But power, built in silence, always attracts questions. And questions in medieval Europe often turned into accusations. Inside the order itself, discipline remained strict, almost terrifyingly absolute. A knight did not belong to himself anymore. His loyalty was not personal, not emotional, not flexible. It belonged entirely to the order. He could be sent anywhere, at any time, without question. He could be separated from everything he knew and still be expected to obey without hesitation. This system created strength, but it also created fractures. Not every knight was equal. Not every command felt just. Not every decision made by distant leadership was understood by those in the field. And in those silent gaps between obedience and doubt, tension began to grow. Some knights began to question the direction of the order. Others began to fear what it had become. A military brotherhood had slowly transformed into something closer to a political empire. Fortresses were no longer just defensive positions, they were symbols of control. Wealth was no longer just support for war, it was influence over kings. And influence is always dangerous when it becomes too large to challenge. Across Europe, rumors began to circulate. At first they were small whispers in taverns, courts, and churches. Then they became louder, more structured accusations. People spoke of hidden rituals, secret ceremonies, and forbidden knowledge. Nothing was fully proven, but in medieval politics, proof was often less important than belief. Kings who once relied on the Templars began to see them differently. Dependency slowly transformed into fear. Fear slowly transformed into hostility. Among all rulers, one figure would become central to the collapse that followed. King Philip IV of France. His kingdom was deeply tied to the financial networks of the Templars. Loans, debts, and political dependence created a fragile balance of power. And when that balance began to tilt, Philip saw an opportunity, not just to weaken an order, but to erase a debt. On a quiet morning that would later become infamous, that balance broke. Across France, Templar knights were arrested simultaneously. Not in open battle, but in coordinated surprise. Doors were broken, halls were stormed, and warriors who had once survived the Crusades found themselves chained not by enemies on a battlefield, but by their own former allies. The accusations were severe, shocking, and carefully designed to destroy reputation. Heresy, blasphemy, secret rites, betrayal of faith. Whether true or constructed, they served one purpose: to dismantle the order completely. Inside prisons and interrogation chambers, knights who had once sworn silence were now forced into impossible situations. Confessions were extracted under pressure. Loyalty was tested beyond endurance. Some broke, some resisted, Some disappeared into history without clear record of what they truly believed or experienced. And slowly, the order began to collapse under its own weight. But the fall of the Templars was not just a legal or political event, it was psychological. It shattered the image of the knightly order as untouchable. If an organization is powerful, wealthy, and widespread as the Templars could be destroyed, then no knightly structure was truly safe. Other orders watched in silence. The Hospitallers adjusted. The Teutonic Knights shifted focus. Every remaining military order in Europe learned a new lesson. Power without political protection is vulnerable. As the trials continued, Europe witnessed a transformation. The knight was no longer just a sacred warrior protected by divine authority. He had become part of a system that could be questioned, accused, and dismantled by the same world that once celebrated him. And beneath the surface of this collapse, something deeper changed. The idea of absolute knightly unity began to break. Knights who once believed in a shared eternal mission now saw the fragility of their existence. Loyalty to God, loyalty to order, loyalty to kings, these once felt aligned. Now they appeared divided, manipulated by human ambition. Internal wars did not always require swords. Sometimes they were fought through suspicion, politics, and survival instincts. Some knights adapted by aligning closer to royal power. Others withdrew into silence, focusing only on survival. And some clung desperately to the original ideals of honor, even as the world around them no longer recognized those ideals as enough. The fall of the Templars became a warning written in history without needing a final battlefield. There was no last heroic stand that defined their end. Instead, there was disbandment, interrogation, exile, and quiet disappearance. A powerful order did not fall in glory. It dissolved under pressure. And that absence of a dramatic ending made the story even more haunting. Because it showed something medieval Europe was not ready to accept openly. Even the strongest knightly order was not immortal. As the dust of this collapse settled, the meaning of knighthood itself began to shift again. The age of crusader dominance was fading. Centralized kingdoms were rising. Gunpowder was beginning to appear in distant forms, and the battlefield was slowly changing in ways that armored cavalry could not fully control. The knight was still present in society, still respected, still feared, but something essential had changed. He was no longer the center of war. He was becoming a symbol of a past age, and as the surviving knightly orders adapted to this new reality, a quiet truth remained in the background of Europe's consciousness. The age that created knights was beginning to move on without them. But their secrets, the wealth, the betrayals, the unanswered questions surrounding their fall would continue to echo long after the last Templar trial was finished. As Europe moved beyond the height of the Crusades and the great knightly orders began to fade from their former dominance, a new age slowly emerged. An age that did not need knights in the same way anymore. It did not announce itself with a single moment or a single battle. It arrived gradually through changes in weapons, politics, and the very logic of war itself. For centuries, the knight had ruled the battlefield as the ultimate expression of armored power. He was fast on horseback, protected by steel, and trained in close combat that demanded discipline and courage. Entire systems of warfare were built around him. Castles were designed to resist him. Infantry formations were built to support or stop him. Even kings measured their military strength by the number of knights they could command. But But history does not remain loyal to any single form of power. The first cracks in knightly dominance appeared not through defeat, but through innovation. In distant regions and early experiments of warfare, a new force was slowly developing: gunpowder. At first it was crude, unstable, and unreliable. Early firearms were loud, slow, and often more dangerous to the user than the enemy. But even in their primitive form, they introduced something that medieval armor could not fully resist: impact beyond skill. A knight's strength had always come from mastery, timing, training, precision, and physical endurance. But gunpowder changed the equation. A weapon no longer needed years of training to be deadly. A common soldier with minimal instruction could now potentially kill a knight in full armor from a distance. This shift did not destroy knighthood immediately. Instead, it began to undermine its foundation slowly and consistently. On battlefields across Europe, traditional cavalry charges still took place. Knights still rode with banners, still wore heraldic armor, still believed in the structured chaos of chivalric warfare. But now they faced something new: formations of infantry, equipped with early firearms and supported by artillery that shattered the assumptions of close combat. Armor, once a symbol of invincibility, began to feel heavier, not just physically, but symbolically. It became less of a guarantee and more of a risk. A knight charging forward now faced not only spears and swords, but also distant thunder-like shots that could pierce through steel and end the charge before it truly began. And in this changing environment, the idea of chivalry began to strain. Chivalry had once been more than battlefield etiquette. It was an entire moral framework: honor, loyalty, protection of the weak, respect for enemies of noble status. These were the ideals that gave meaning to the knightly class. Songs, poems, and courtly traditions reinforced the belief that knights were not just killers, but guardians of a higher moral order. But war rarely respects moral order for long. As conflicts became larger, more political, and more technologically complex, survival began to outweigh ritual. Battles were no longer small, controlled engagements between noble forces. They became mass conflicts involving mercenaries, infantry, artillery, and evolving military strategies that cared less about honor and more about efficiency. In this environment, the knight's code began to fracture. A charging knight could still be admired, but he was no longer the defining force of victory. He could still show courage, but courage alone could not overcome formations designed to stop cavalry. He could still embody honor, but honor did not stop gunfire. Even noble courts, once the heart of chivalric culture, began to change. Kings who had once relied on knightly loyalty now invested in professional armies. Warfare was becoming centralized, organized, and increasingly dependent on resources rather than individual warrior elites. The medieval battlefield was dissolving into something new. Yet knights did not disappear overnight. Instead, they adapted, slowly and unevenly. Some became officers in emerging armies. Others turned into symbols of nobility rather than practical soldiers. Some were absorbed into royal households, where their role became ceremonial, guarding tradition rather than shaping the outcome of wars. But even in their adaptation, their identity changed. The knight was no longer the core of military power. He was becoming a representation of it. The final centuries of medieval knighthood saw this transformation become undeniable. Armor became
more decorative than functional in many contexts. Tournaments replaced real warfare as spaces where knightly skill could still be displayed. These events preserved the appearance of chivalry, but they were no longer the reality of survival-based combat. Behind the pageantry, the world had already moved on. Gunpowder artillery grew stronger. Firearms became more reliable. Infantry tactics evolved rapidly. And with each innovation, the space for traditional mounted knights grew smaller. The battlefield no longer belonged to the armored individual. It belonged to systems, formations, and technology.
And so the knight began his final transformation, not as a sudden disappearance, but as a fading function. In some regions, knights became landowners who focused more on governance than warfare. In others, they became purely ceremonial figures, participating in court rituals that preserved the memory of an earlier age. Their armor, once essential for survival, became symbolic, displayed in halls as reminders of ancestry rather than tools of war. Even the language of knighthood changed. Words like honor, glory, and chivalry remained powerful in literature and storytelling, but they increasingly belonged to a romanticized past rather than the present reality of war. And this is where the most important transformation took place, not on the battlefield, but in memory. As the practical function of knights declined, their legend expanded. Writers, poets, and later historians began to reshape the knight into something larger than life. He became the symbol of a lost age of honor, a figure standing against chaos, a reminder of a world where courage seemed more visible, even if the reality had always been more complex. The contradictions of knighthood were slowly refined into myth. The brutality of war was softened in memory. The political ambition behind many campaigns was downplayed. The failures, betrayals, and internal corruption were often overshadowed by stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and heroic last stands. And so the knight survived, not as a dominant force of history, but as a powerful idea within it. By the end of this transformation, medieval knighthood no longer existed in its original form. The armored cavalry that once dominated Europe had been replaced by new military systems, but the image of the knight endured far beyond the battlefield. He became literature, he became symbol, he became legend, and perhaps most importantly, he became a mirror through which later generations interpreted their own ideas of honor, war, and identity. Because even when the age of knights ended, the questions they represented did not disappear. What does it mean to be honorable in war? What is loyalty when power shifts? And what remains of glory when survival changes its shape? These questions outlived the knights themselves, and their answers are still being debated long after the sound of armor and horses finally faded from Europe's battlefields. When the last echoes of medieval battlefields began to fade, there was no single moment that could be called the end of the knights. No final trumpet, no last unified charge that closed the chapter of history. Instead, the knight simply stopped being necessary in the way he once was. And that is what made his ending so different from his beginning. Knighthood had been born from chaos. Fragmented kingdoms, constant warfare, unstable borders, and a world where protection depended on armored individuals trained from childhood to fight. But as Europe evolved, power began to concentrate. Kings strengthened centralized states. Armies became professional. weapons became mechanical, and warfare stopped revolving around individual skill and started revolving around systems. In that transformation, the knight did not die, he was absorbed. Some former knights became officers in royal armies, adapting to new tactics and new hierarchies. Others turned into landowners and administrators, their military identity slowly replaced by political responsibility. Many simply faded into obscurity, their families continuing noble lineages that still carried titles long after the battlefield relevance had disappeared. But while the practical knight disappeared, something else grew in his place. The myth of the knight became stronger than the knight himself ever was. Across Europe, storytellers, poets, and chroniclers began shaping a version of the knight that was cleaner, more idealized, and more emotionally powerful than historical reality often allowed. In these retellings, the knight became a near-perfect figure, brave without hesitation, loyal without contradiction, honorable even in the darkest circumstances. The violence was still present, but softened into narrative necessity. The political manipulation was often reduced or ignored. The betrayals, internal conflicts, and moral compromises that had defined much of medieval warfare were pushed into the background. What remained in the cultural memory was the symbol, a rider in shining armor, a sword raised not just for war, but for justice, a figure standing between chaos and order. This image became so powerful that it survived far beyond the medieval world itself. Even as gunpowder armies, modern states, and industrial warfare transformed the nature of conflict, the idea of the knight continued to reappear in literature, art, and later popular culture. But beneath the myth, history preserved a more complicated truth. The knight was never just one thing. He was both protector and destroyer, both servant of faith and instrument of politics, both disciplined warrior and participant in systems of ambition that often extended beyond personal honor. The knight served kings who pursued power as much as protection. He fought in wars that were sometimes justified, sometimes political, and sometimes deeply unnecessary. He operated within a world where morality and survival were constantly intertwined, and where decisions were rarely as clean as later legends would suggest. Even the most famous knightly institutions carried this duality. The Knights Templar, once seen as guardians of pilgrims and holy warriors of Christendom, became in later history a symbol of both admiration and suspicion. Their rise reflected the extraordinary power knightly orders could achieve. Their fall revealed how quickly that power could be dismantled when political forces turned against them. And in that rise and fall, a deeper lesson of the knightly age became visible. No warrior class remains eternal, not even one wrapped in faith, honor, and centuries of tradition. As Europe moved into the early modern era, the memory of knights became increasingly detached from their original function. Castles turned into heritage sites. Armor turned into ceremonial displays. Tournaments turned into controlled performances of a fading identity. The battlefield no longer needed armored individuals charging on horseback to decide outcomes. But the idea of the knight refused to disappear, because symbols survive where systems fail to remain. The knight became a foundation for storytelling, shaping the way later societies imagined heroism. From medieval romances to modern fiction, the knight continued to appear as a moral archetype, sometimes realistic, sometimes fantastical, but always emotionally resonant. He became the embodiment of a question every generation asks in its own way. Can power and morality truly exist together? Or are they always in tension? The knight's legacy does not provide a single answer. Instead, it reflects the contradictions of human history itself. He represents both the aspiration toward honor and the reality of violence, both the desire for justice and the complexity of political survival. And perhaps that is why the knight remains so enduring. Because he is not just a figure from the past. He is a mirror, a reflection of how societies understand courage, loyalty, and conflict in every age that comes after him. When we look back at medieval knights, we are not only seeing armored warriors riding through fields of war, we are also seeing how history transforms real lives into stories, and how stories transform into myths that shape future generations. The medieval knight, in the end, did not simply disappear. He evolved into memory. And memory, unlike armor or steel, cannot be destroyed by time. It continues to live in language, in culture, in imagination, and in the endless retelling of a world where glory and blood were inseparable, and where secrets still echo beneath the surface of legend. And so the story closes not with silence, but with continuation. Because the age of knights may have ended, but the idea of the knight never truly did. When the age of classical medieval knighthood began to fade, what remained of the knights did not simply vanish into history. They scattered into a changing world that no longer needed them in the same way. Some knights tried to hold on to the old identity. They still carried swords, still wore partial armor, still followed fragments of the chivalric code that once defined their entire existence. But the world around them had already moved forward. Kings no longer depended on scattered noble warriors. Instead, they began building centralized armies, paid soldiers, disciplined infantry, and early gunpowder units that could be trained faster and controlled more tightly than traditional knightly forces. This shift created a silent crisis, because a knight without war is no longer a knight in practice, only in name. Many of these displaced warriors turned into something new, mercenaries. They sold their skill to the highest bidder, fighting in wars that had nothing to do with honor, faith, or duty. What once was sacred service became contract-based violence. Loyalty was no longer to a king or a code, but to payment and survival. This was the beginning of the knight's moral fragmentation. Former brothers in arms who once fought under shared banners now found themselves on opposite sides of conflicts, blades crossing without recognition or emotional connection. The old sense of knightly brotherhood, once reinforced through training, religion, and shared ideology, began to dissolve. And in this collapse, something deeper broke inside the identity of knighthood itself. Because knighthood was never only about armor or skill, it was about meaning. Without meaning, or even the strongest warrior becomes directionless. Across Europe, castles that once echoed with the footsteps of armored knights became quieter. Tournaments still existed, but they felt increasingly ceremonial, almost disconnected from the brutal reality of war that had once defined their purpose. Armor became heavier to wear in symbolism than in function. Swords became inherited objects rather than everyday tools of survival. And yet war did not disappear. It evolved. Gunpowder weapons continued to spread. Infantry formations became more structured. Siege warfare became more destructive. Entire fortifications that once resisted knightly assaults now crumbled under artillery fire. The battlefield no longer rewarded individual heroism in the same way. It rewarded coordination, logistics, and technology. In this new reality, the knight's traditional strengths, personal courage, mounted charge, close combat mastery, became increasingly limited. And so many who once would have been knights were absorbed into new military roles. Some became cavalry officers in modernizing armies. Others became symbolic guards for royal courts. A few preserved fragments of the old traditions in isolated regions, holding on to rituals that no longer carried the same practical meaning. But the most important transformation was not military. It was psychological. The knightly identity, once absolute, became fragmented. For centuries, a knight could define himself through a clear structure: service, honor, faith, and combat. Now, each of those pillars was being questioned or replaced. Service became bureaucracy. Honor became reputation. Faith became personal belief rather than institutional obligation. Combat became specialized rather than personal. This created a generation caught between two worlds. They were too trained to become ordinary civilians, but too outdated to remain dominant warriors. And in that in-between state, many knights developed a sense of loss that was not just professional, but existential. They were watching the disappearance of the world that created them. Even the memory of the great knightly orders carried this contradiction. The Knights Templar, which had once embodied both military strength and institutional power, had already become a historical warning rather than an active force. Their dramatic rise and destruction became a reference point for how even the most powerful knightly structures could fall when political tides shifted. But beyond the famous orders, countless smaller knightly lineages also faded quietly. Families that once built their identity around service and war slowly transformed into aristocratic households focused on land management, court influence, and survival within changing political systems. The sword was no longer the center of identity. It became an artifact of ancestry. And as generations passed, stories began to replace experience. Children of noble families heard tales of their ancestors' battlefield courage, but they did not live those realities themselves. The knight became something inherited in memory rather than practiced in life. This is how myth begins to grow, not suddenly, but gradually, as lived experience fades and storytelling becomes dominant. And so the knight entered the next phase of his existence, not as a warrior, not as a system, but as a symbol drifting away from its original world. A symbol waiting to be reshaped by imagination, literature, and time itself. As the medieval world continued to fracture into newer forms of warfare and political control, the knight's identity did not simply fade. It was pulled apart, piece by piece, and scattered into roles that no longer carried the unity of the old chivalric system. The age of loyal banners and sacred oaths was giving way to something far more unstable: mercenary warfare. In this new reality, soldiers were no longer defined primarily by noble birth or lifelong service to a single lord. Instead, they were defined by contracts, wages, and shifting alliances. Men who would once have been trained as knights now found themselves fighting not for honor, not for faith, and not even for land, but for payment. This transformation did not happen overnight. It emerged gradually as kingdoms expanded their ambitions and required larger, more flexible armies than the traditional knightly structure could provide. War became longer, more complex, and more expensive.
And in that environment, the rigid system of knighthood began to lose its dominance. Mercenary companies rose to fill the gap. These groups were often brutal, highly experienced, and dangerously pragmatic. They fought for whoever could afford them, switching sides when contracts ended or better offers appeared. In their world, loyalty was not sacred, it was negotiable. For the old knightly ideal, this was a collapse of identity, because the knight was never meant to be a hired weapon. He was meant to represent stability in chaos, a moral force bound by oath rather than money. But now that distinction was dissolving. Battlefields across Europe became crowded with soldiers who shared no common ideology. They were united only by conflict itself. In such conditions, violence became more unpredictable, less structured, and often more devastating for civilians caught in between. Villages were burned not as part of noble warfare, but as strategic pressure. Cities were besieged not for symbolic victory, but for economic control. The romanticized image of controlled knightly combat faded, replaced by prolonged suffering and resource-driven destruction. And yet, even as the practical knight disappeared, his image did not. Instead, it transformed into something darker and more mysterious. This is where the legend of the Black Knight begins to take shape. Not a single historical figure, but a growing myth that appeared in different regions under different names. The Black Knight became a symbol of the unknown warrior, an armored figure without allegiance, identity, or mercy. Sometimes he was described as a fallen knight who had abandoned his oath. Sometimes as a mercenary, so skilled and violent that his identity was erased by fear. Sometimes as a symbolic representation of death itself on the battlefield. The Black Knight myth reflected a deeper anxiety of the late medieval world, that once honor is removed from war, what remains is only violence without meaning. In stories and oral traditions, the Black Knight often appeared at moments of greatest chaos. Duels, ambushes, wars between fractured kingdoms. He was never fully explained. He did not represent a stable character, but a fear. The fear that knights without code become indistinguishable from the destruction they once claimed to control. And this leads directly into another transformation, the fading of chivalry itself. The code of chivalry, once presented as the moral backbone of knighthood, did not disappear in a single moment. Instead, it eroded slowly under the pressure of real warfare, political ambition, and survival necessity. In theory, chivalry demanded honor in combat, protection of the weak, loyalty to rightful authority, and restraint in violence. But in practice, medieval warfare increasingly required efficiency over restraint. Siege warfare punished mercy. Political conflicts rewarded betrayal. Mercenary forces ignored traditional moral boundaries entirely. As a result, chivalry became more symbolic than functional. It was still spoken about in courts. It was still written in literature. It was still invoked in ceremonies. But on the battlefield, it often existed only in fragments dependent on circumstance rather than universal rule. Some knights still tried to follow it strictly, holding on to the old ideals even as the world around them changed. Others adapted it selectively, following its principles when convenient and ignoring them when necessary for survival. And many abandoned it entirely, especially those who had become part of mercenary systems or hybrid military roles. This created a deep internal contradiction within the identity of the knight. He was expected to represent a moral ideal that the world no longer consistently rewarded.
And that contradiction is where medieval violence reveals its darkest truth. Because violence in this era was not only physical, it was structural. It was embedded in politics, economics, and social hierarchy. Wars were not isolated events, but continuous processes that reshaped entire regions. Armies moved through landscapes that were not just battlefields, but living spaces filled with civilians who had no control over the conflicts surrounding them. Knights, mercenaries, and soldiers all participated in this system, but their motivations varied widely. Some still believed in honor. Some fought for survival. Some sought wealth. Some were trapped by obligation. And in this mixture of motives, the clarity of earlier knightly ideals disappeared. What remained was a world where the line between hero and aggressor became increasingly difficult to define. Yet even in this blurred reality, the figure of the knight continued to evolve. In literature and oral tradition, he became more symbolic, more extreme in contrast. The noble knight and the fallen knight began to exist side by side in cultural imagination. One represented order and virtue, the other represented chaos and moral collapse. This duality strengthened the mythological structure of knighthood, because now the knight was no longer just a historical warrior class. He was a narrative tool used to explore human conflict itself. And as the medieval world moved further into its late stages, this symbolic transformation became more important than the actual military role of knights. The battlefield no longer needed them in the way it once did, but storytelling did. And so the knight survived, not in armor, but in imagination shaped by both admiration and fear. As Europe moved deeper into the late medieval period, the world that had once created knights began to fracture into something far more centralized, political, and unstable in a different way. The battlefield was no longer shaped by small feudal loyalties alone. It was now dominated by expanding kingdoms, dynastic struggles, and wars of succession that stretched across entire regions. In earlier centuries, a knight could define his purpose through a single lord, a single castle, and a relatively stable hierarchy of loyalty. But in the late medieval world, that structure began to collapse under the weight of larger political ambitions. Thrones were no longer just inherited peacefully. They were contested, challenged, and reshaped through long and exhausting conflicts that pulled in entire populations. These wars of succession changed the nature of conflict itself. Instead of localized feudal skirmishes, Europe saw prolonged struggles where entire kingdoms were divided internally. Nobles switched allegiances, cities changed hands multiple times, and military campaigns became continuous cycles of siege and counter-siege. In this environment, the traditional role of the knight as a decisive battlefield force began to weaken even further. Castles, once the symbolic and strategic center of knightly power, also began to lose their dominance. While still important, they were no longer the unbreakable strongholds they once appeared to be. New siege technologies, improved artillery, and more organized military strategies meant that even the strongest fortifications could be pressured, starved, or eventually breached. The knight, who had once been the primary defender of these castles, was now only one part of a much larger military system. Inside these castles, life also changed. The romantic image of a knight constantly preparing for battle gave way to a more administrative reality. Lords and nobles increasingly focused on governance, taxation, diplomacy, and managing larger territories. Military identity was still present, but it was no longer the central defining role of the aristocracy. And outside the castles, the battlefield was transforming even faster. The rise of professional armies continued to accelerate.
Infantry formations became more disciplined. Early firearms and artillery grew more effective and more widely used. War was becoming less about individual martial skill and more about coordination, supply lines, and technological advantage. In this new system, the armored knight on horseback, once the ultimate symbol of battlefield dominance, was becoming increasingly specialized, limited, and situational. There were still moments where heavy cavalry charges could break enemy lines. There were still battles where knights played important tactical roles, but they were no longer the defining force of war. They were one component among many, and often not the most decisive one. This gradual reduction of knightly dominance did not happen with a single collapse. It happened through repetition, battle after battle, war after war, where new military methods slowly proved more effective than traditional knightly tactics. And yet, even as their military importance declined, knights did not vanish immediately from society. Instead, they adapted into new roles that reflected the changing world around them. Some became officers within emerging national armies, transferring their experience into structured military hierarchies that no longer depended on feudal loyalty. Others transitioned into courtly roles where their presence became symbolic rather than tactical. They represented tradition, status, and continuity in a world that was rapidly changing. But beneath this adaptation, something more emotional was happening. A sense of disappearance. Knights of the late medieval period were often aware, whether directly or indirectly, that they were part of a fading system. They were living through a transition where the values, methods, and structures that had defined their identity were slowly being replaced. This awareness created a subtle tension in the culture of knighthood. Tournaments, for example, became increasingly important during this time, not as preparation for real war, but as controlled environments where knightly identity could still be expressed. These events preserved the appearance of chivalry, honor, and martial skill, even as actual warfare moved in a different direction. In a sense, tournaments became memory spaces, performances of an identity that was no longer central to survival. Meanwhile, castles that once functioned as active military hubs began to shift into symbols of heritage and power rather than frontline defense. Their importance remained, but their function evolved. They became seats of administration, centers of noble identity, and later historical monuments of a fading age. And in this fading, the final phase of knightly warfare quietly unfolded. The last true battlefield dominance of the traditional knight did not end with a dramatic announcement. It ended through accumulation, through repeated changes in technology, strategy, and political organization that made older forms of warfare increasingly obsolete. As gunpowder weapons became more reliable and widely integrated into military systems, heavily armored cavalry lost more of its strategic advantage. Infantry-based armies, supported by ranged weaponry and evolving artillery, began to dominate major conflicts across Europe. The knight's charge, once feared as an unstoppable force, became a calculated risk rather than a guaranteed breakthrough. And with that shift, the medieval knight, as a primary military institution, effectively reached its final stage. Not extinction, but transformation into something else entirely. He no longer shaped the battlefield as he once did,
Instead, he existed within it as a legacy system, still present, still respected, but no longer central. This is the moment where medieval knighthood enters its final historical transition. The world that created knights has fundamentally changed, and the knight, in turn, is forced into his final identity shift, from active warrior class to historical symbol in progress. But even as his practical role diminishes, his cultural presence begins to expand, because the more he disappears from reality, the more he grows in memory. And that memory will soon become stronger than the history that created it. As the late medieval world pushed forward into its final phase of transformation, warfare reached a point where the old identity of the knight no longer fit the reality of battle. What had once been the centerpiece of European warfare was now standing at the edge of irrelevance, not through sudden defeat, but through gradual replacement. The final battles of the knightly era were not always dramatic endings written in a single heroic moment. Instead, they were layered events where old and new military systems collided. On one side, armored cavalry still charged with discipline, tradition, and inherited belief in the power of individual courage. On the other side, organized infantry formations, supported by increasingly effective gunpowder weapons, held ground with mechanical consistency and collective strategy. In these confrontations, something important began to happen. The knight stopped being the decisive force of the battlefield. There were still moments of bravery, charges that broke through lines, individual acts of courage that would later be remembered in stories. But they no longer determined the outcome of wars in the way they once had. Victory now depended on coordination, logistics, and emerging technologies that reduced the battlefield role of heavily armored individuals. This shift did not only change military outcomes, it changed identity. Knights who had been trained from childhood to believe in their central role in war began to confront a reality where their skills were no longer sufficient to guarantee dominance. The psychological impact of this transition was profound. It was not just a loss of function, it was a loss of meaning. Some knights adapted by integrating into early modern armies, serving as cavalry officers under centralized command structures that no longer depended on feudal loyalty. Others withdrew into ceremonial roles where their presence became symbolic rather than tactical. A few continued to fight in traditional ways, holding on to older methods even as the battlefield moved away from them. But across all regions, a shared transformation was occurring. The knight was becoming a figure of transition rather than control. In the final conflicts, where knights still played visible roles, their presence often carried a symbolic weight that exceeded their tactical importance. A charging knight represented tradition confronting change. Steel armor meeting gunpowder represented the collision of two eras. And in this collision, the image of the knight began to take on a tragic dimension. This is where the idea of symbolic knight deaths begins to emerge. Not necessarily as literal individual deaths, but as the end of knightly identity on the battlefield. In many later accounts and historical interpretations, certain battles are remembered not just for their military outcomes, but for what they represented, the fading of an entire class of warrior. The armored knight becomes less a functional unit of war and more a visual marker of a disappearing world. As early modern armies rose, they brought with them a fundamentally different approach to warfare. These armies were no longer built around personal loyalty or noble obligation alone.
They were structured through centralized authority, paid soldiers, standardized training, and increasingly sophisticated coordination. The battlefield became more uniform, more system-driven, and less dependent on individual martial identity. Firearms and artillery continued to evolve, gradually reshaping the entire logic of combat. Distance replaced close combat as the dominant factor in many engagements. Armor, once essential for survival, became increasingly impractical in the face of penetrating force delivered from afar. In this environment, the knight's traditional strengths were no longer central, but his emotional and cultural significance remained powerful. Even as his military role diminished, societies across Europe continued to remember the knight as a symbol of courage, loyalty, and idealized honor. This created a deep, emotional contrast between reality and memory. On the battlefield, the knight was fading. In memory, he was growing stronger. This emotional tension marked the true end of real knighthood as a living system. It was not the end of knights as individuals. Many continued to exist in various forms, but the end of knighthood as the dominant framework of warfare and identity. The world that had once needed knights to define its battles no longer required them in the same way. And yet it could not easily let go of what they represented, because the knight had always been more than a soldier. He had been a concept built on loyalty, sacrifice, discipline, and the belief that individual courage could shape the outcome of chaos. As early modern armies fully emerged, that concept did not disappear. It simply moved out of the battlefield and into culture, storytelling, and historical memory. And so the emotional ending of real knighthood is not marked by a single fall, but by a slow realization across generations. The age of armored individuals shaping history through personal combat had ended. But the idea they represented had not. It was already moving into legend. When the real age of knights faded from the battlefield, history did not close the book on them. Instead, something unexpected happened. The knight left reality and entered imagination with even greater force. As early modern Europe stabilized under centralized kingdoms and evolving military systems, people began to look back at the medieval past not as something practical, but as something emotional. The knight, once a living instrument of war, was now becoming a subject of memory, storytelling, and cultural reconstruction. This transformation did not happen in a single place or time. It grew gradually through poetry, court literature, oral tradition, and later historical writing. In these retellings, the knight was reshaped, not as he always was, but as people wished he had been. He became more coherent than reality allowed, more honorable than war often produced, more loyal than political systems could consistently support. And this process created a powerful shift, the birth of the romantic knight. In romanticized accounts, the knight was no longer just a participant in violent conflict. He became a moral figure, moving through a chaotic world, guided by an internal code that elevated him above ordinary violence. His armor was no longer just protection, it became symbolism. His sword was no longer just a weapon, it became identity. His loyalty was no longer conditional, it became absolute. This version of the knight spread widely through literature and cultural imagination. Stories emphasized heroic journeys, tragic sacrifices, noble duels, and unwavering devotion to ideals like honor and love. Even when these stories were based loosely on historical reality, They were reshaped to highlight meaning over accuracy. At the same time, the darker, more complex realities of medieval warfare began to recede into the background of popular memory. The political manipulation, the mercenary violence, the shifting loyalties, and the brutal conditions of many conflicts became less visible in cultural retellings. Instead, what remained was a refined image. A knight standing alone on a battlefield, facing overwhelming odds with courage. A loyal warrior protecting the weak, even at great personal cost. A figure caught between duty and morality, choosing honor even when the world does not reward it. This romantic image became so powerful that it eventually influenced how later generations understood their own history. But beneath this romantic layer, something more complicated still existed in historical records. The knight had never been purely ideal. He had always existed in tension between reality and expectation, and that tension itself became part of his legacy. In some regions, stories also preserved what could be called secret histories, accounts that focused not on idealized heroes, but on contradictions within knighthood. These included tales of betrayal among nobles, hidden conflicts between knightly orders, and the political manipulation that shaped many military decisions. Even the legacy of powerful institutions like the Knights Templar became part of this layered memory. Their historical rise and dramatic destruction left behind questions that later generations continued to reinterpret, sometimes as cautionary tales, sometimes as mysteries, and sometimes as symbols of lost authority. Over time, these competing narratives, romantic and critical, heroic and skeptical, merged into a complex cultural image of the knight. He was no longer a single historical truth. He had become a multidimensional symbol. By the time modern culture fully emerged, the knight had already been reborn many times. In literature, he became a central figure in epic storytelling. In art, he became a visual representation of medieval identity. In later popular culture, he evolved again, sometimes realistic, sometimes fantastical, but always recognizable. The armor remained, the horse remained, the sword remained, but their meaning shifted depending on the era interpreting them. In modern imagination, the knight often represents ideals that feel universal. Courage in adversity, loyalty under pressure, honor in conflict, and the struggle between personal morality and external force. Even when these ideals are not historically perfect reflections of medieval life, they carry emotional truth that continues to resonate. This is the final transformation of knighthood. From historical warrior class to declining military system, to symbolic cultural identity, to eternal myth. The knight no longer belongs to a single century. He belongs to interpretation. And that is why he continues to survive. Because unlike many historical institutions, the knight was not only defined by what he did in war, but by what people believed he represented. And belief does not end when systems collapse, it evolves. In the end, the medieval knight becomes something larger than history itself. He becomes a mirror through which each generation reflects its own understanding of honor, violence, and meaning. And that is why, even after the armor rusts, the castles crumble, and the battlefields change forever, the knight still rides on, not in reality, but in memory that refuses to disappear. When the knight finally left the battlefield of history, he did not leave the human mind. Instead, he entered a new domain, modern interpretation. And in this space, the knight became something far more flexible
than he ever was in medieval reality. In the modern world, the knight is no longer defined by armor, horse, or feudal loyalty. He is defined by meaning. And meaning changes depending on who is telling the story. Writers, filmmakers, historians, and even game designers began to reshape the medieval knight into countless versions. Some versions stayed close to historical reality, showing the brutality, the politics, and the uncertainty of medieval warfare. Other versions moved far into idealization, where knights became almost mythic defenders of justice in a morally simplified world. This duality created a permanent split in modern imagination. One knight belongs to history. The other belongs to storytelling. In cinema and literature, knights are often portrayed as tragic heroes, figures caught between duty and conscience, loyalty and morality, violence and honor. Their armor becomes symbolic rather than functional. Their battles become emotional as much as physical. And their choices are framed as reflections of universal human conflict rather than purely historical circumstance. In interactive media and gaming culture, the knight takes on yet another transformation. He becomes customizable, adaptable, and often idealized as a playable identity. Players step into the role of armored warriors who embody strength, honor, or personal code depending on narrative choice. In this form, the knight is no longer a fixed historical figure but a flexible archetype of power and identity. But alongside these creative interpretations, more speculative ideas also emerged over time, what might be called hidden theories surrounding medieval knights. These theories do not always come from academic history, but from cultural curiosity. They often focus on mysteries surrounding knightly orders, lost knowledge, secret rituals, and unexplained historical gaps. One of the most frequently discussed subjects in this space is the legacy of the Knights Templar. Because of their sudden rise to power and dramatic historical downfall, the Templars became a focal point for imagination. Some interpretations suggest hidden wealth. Others speculate about lost documents, secret traditions, or influence extending beyond their official historical timeline. While many of these ideas remain speculative and not supported by mainstream historical evidence, they reflect a broader human tendency to fill historical silence with narrative meaning. And this is important because knights, as a concept, thrive in narrative space. Where history becomes incomplete, imagination expands. In modern scholarship, however, the knight is understood more carefully. Historians reconstruct knighthood not as a single unified ideal, but as a complex social institution shaped by economics, politics, religion, and warfare. This perspective strips away romantic simplification and replaces it with structural understanding. Yet even within this academic clarity, the emotional resonance of the knight remains, because the knight is not only a subject of history, he is also a reflection of values. In contemporary society, the word knight is often used symbolically to describe qualities like courage, integrity, and protection of others. It appears in awards, titles, metaphors, and cultural expressions. The concept has expanded beyond its medieval origin into a universal symbol of honorable struggle. This is why the knight still feels relevant, even in a world that no longer uses swords or armor in war. He represents a question that modern life still struggles with. How do we balance power with morality? How do we act with courage in uncertain systems? And how do we define honor in environments where rules constantly change? These questions are not medieval, they are timeless. and the knight remains one of the clearest historical figures through which they are explored. Even in popular culture today, the knight often appears not as a literal warrior, but as a metaphorical identity. He can be a protector, a rebel, a fallen hero, or a disciplined guardian. Each version reflects a different interpretation of strength and responsibility. And in this ongoing reinterpretation, the knight becomes something unusual in history, a figure that never fully ends. Unlike many historical roles that disappear completely when their function becomes obsolete, knighthood survives by transforming its meaning rather than its utility. From battlefield to literature, from history to myth, from myth to modern identity. And in each stage, it adapts without losing its core symbolic weight. So in today's world, the knight is no longer a man in armor riding into battle. He is an idea that continues to evolve. A reminder that history is not only what happened, but also what people choose to remember, reshape, and carry forward. And as long as stories exist, the knight will continue to exist with them, not as a soldier of the past, but as a symbol of the human struggle to define honor within chaos. The story of medieval knights is not a single story at all. It is two histories existing at the same time, one written in records of war, politics, and survival, and another written in imagination, memory, and cultural longing. To understand knighthood fully, both must be seen together. Because if you only see one, the picture becomes incomplete. The historical knight was a product of necessity. He emerged in a fragmented Europe where centralized power was weak, and local lords depended on armored cavalry to enforce control, defend territory, and project authority. His world was shaped by feudal obligation, military service, and the constant instability of medieval politics. He was trained from youth, bound by oath, and shaped by a system where violence was not an exception. It was a structure of life. His armor was not symbolic. It was survival. His sword was not romantic. It was practical. His loyalty was not abstract. It was contractual and hierarchical. And yet, even within this reality, ideals began to form. Honor, loyalty, courage, protection of the weak. These ideas were not always consistently practiced, but they existed as cultural expectations that influenced behavior, justified authority, and created identity within the warrior class. But over time, as the medieval world changed, something shifted. The rise of centralized states, professional armies, and gunpowder warfare gradually removed the knight from his original function. The battlefield no longer needed individual armored elites in the same way. War became system-driven, coordinated, and increasingly technological. And so the knight transitioned from necessity to memory. This is where myth begins. Because when a social role disappears, society does not simply forget it. It reinterprets it. The romantic knight was born from this reinterpretation. In literature and cultural storytelling, he became more consistent than the historical reality ever was. He was refined into an archetype of moral strength, loyal beyond betrayal, courageous beyond fear, honorable beyond contradiction. But this refinement came at a cost. Complexity was reduced. The political manipulation behind wars became less visible. The brutality of many conflicts was softened. The economic motivations behind campaigns were often minimized. Even institutions like the Knights Templar became partially absorbed into mystery and symbolic interpretation where fact and imagination often blend in public memory. So the knight exists in two overlapping realities. One is historical, fragmented, contradictory, human. The other is mythological, structured, symbolic, idealized. Neither is fully false, neither is fully complete. And this tension is the key to understanding knighthood. Because the knight is not just a figure of the past. He is a reflection of how societies process violence, authority, and morality. Every generation reshapes him to answer its own questions. When societies value hierarchy and order, the knight appears as a defender of structure. When societies value individual morality, he appears as a lone ethical warrior. When societies question power, he becomes a symbol of both oppression and resistance. This is why the knight survives beyond his historical function. He is not preserved by institutions, he is preserved by interpretation. And this leads to the final philosophical truth at the center of knighthood. The knight never truly belonged to himself. In life, he belonged to feudal systems, kings, orders, and wars. In memory, he belongs to storytellers, historians, and culture itself. His identity is always shaped by something larger than him, whether it is political structure or narrative imagination. And that is why he becomes eternal. Not because he was unchanged, but because he is endlessly redefined. The ultimate conclusion of medieval knighthood is therefore not extinction, but transformation of meaning. The armored warrior disappears from the battlefield, but the idea he carried, honor under pressure, courage in conflict, loyalty under uncertainty, does not disappear with him. It migrates into stories, into symbols, into culture, into modern identity. And in that migration, the knight becomes something that history alone cannot contain. He becomes a mirror for every age that asks the same difficult question. What does it mean to be honorable in a world that is never stable? That question is the true legacy of knighthood. And it is still being answered again and again, long after the last real knight rode out of the medieval world. Even after the knight had already faded from the battlefield and transformed into legend, history did not stop producing stories about him. In fact, in some ways, the disappearance of real knighthood made the imagination even stronger. Because when a system becomes distant in time, it becomes easier to reshape it into something darker, stranger, and more mysterious. Across medieval Europe and the centuries that followed, stories began to circulate that did not always fit neatly into official historical records. These were not always false in a simple sense, but they lived in the gray space between memory, rumor, fear, and symbolic storytelling. One of the most persistent themes in these forbidden or shadowed narratives was the idea that beneath the surface of knighthood there existed hidden knowledge, rituals, codes, and secrets, known only to select groups. Some of these ideas were inspired by real institutions, such as the Knights Templar, whose dramatic rise, wealth, and sudden destruction left behind historical gaps that later imagination eagerly filled. In popular retellings, those gaps became spaces for mystery. Questions replaced certainty. Why did such a powerful order collapse so suddenly? What knowledge, if any, did they preserve beyond military function? What truly existed behind closed doors in isolated commanderies across Europe? Historically, many of these questions can be explained through politics, economics, and tensions between monarchy and military religious power. But culturally, they evolved into something more symbolic. The Templars, and by extension knightly orders in general, became vessels for exploring the idea that history always contains unseen layers. Alongside these order-based mysteries, another recurring figure appears in shadowed medieval storytelling, the lost knight. Unlike the heroic knight of romance or the disciplined knight of history, the lost knight is defined by disconnection. He is no longer fully part of any system, not fully loyal to king, not fully bound to order, not fully aligned with chivalric ideals. He exists in transition, exile, or moral ambiguity. In some stories, he is a knight who survived wars but lost his purpose. In others, he is a warrior who rejected his oath after witnessing the collapse of honor in practice. In still others, he is a symbolic figure, representing the psychological cost of endless violence. This idea reflects a deeper truth about medieval warfare that is often less emphasized in romantic narratives. Prolonged violence changes the individual who participates in it. Even within structured codes of conduct, repeated exposure to war creates moral tension, emotional fatigue, and identity fracture. And so, the lost knight becomes not just a fictional archetype, but a symbolic representation of what happens when ideals and reality no longer align. Another layer of shadowed storytelling focuses on what might be called the blackened code of knighthood. In contrast to the idealized code of chivalry, which emphasized honor, protection, and loyalty, these darker interpretations highlight how often those principles were strained or broken under real political pressure. Chivalry was never a single, universally enforced system. It was a cultural ideal that existed alongside war, ambition, survival, and power struggles. In practice, knights operated within a world where mercy could be dangerous, loyalty could be conditional, and honor could be interpreted differently depending on circumstance. This gap between ideal and reality is where much of the darker mythology originates. Because when ideals are high and reality is harsh, the tension between them becomes fertile ground for legend. Stories of brutal sieges, betrayals among nobles, mercenary violence, and shifting allegiances all contributed to a more complex cultural image of knighthood than the romantic version alone can capture. Even though these realities were part of documented history, they often became exaggerated or symbolically reshaped in later storytelling traditions. In this way, medieval knighthood exists not only as a historical system, but also as a narrative battlefield, where competing interpretations fight for dominance. One interpretation presents the knight as the ultimate moral warrior. Another presents him as a product of political necessity and structured violence. Another still presents him as a tragic figure caught between ideals and reality. None of these perspectives fully cancel the others. Instead, they overlap, creating a layered identity that cannot be reduced to a single definition. And this is what makes knighthood uniquely powerful in cultural memory. It refuses simplicity. Even today, when modern audiences encounter knights in literature, film, or games, they are often encountering this layered inheritance. History filtered through centuries of reinterpretation, emotional projection, and symbolic refinement. The armor may look consistent, but the meaning behind it is always shifting. Sometimes it represents justice. Sometimes it represents authority. Sometimes it represents violence. Sometimes it represents nostalgia for a world that never truly existed in the way it is remembered. And beneath all of these interpretations remains a quiet philosophical question. Was the knight ever truly what we think he was? Or is the knight always what we need him to be?
The answer, if there is one, does not belong to a single era.
It belongs to the continuous act of remembering. Because medieval knighthood is not only a chapter in history books, it is an ongoing conversation between fact and imagination, between what was lived and what was believed, between reality and the stories that outlived it. And in that conversation, the knight never truly disappears. He simply changes shape, again and again, each time the story is told. Behind the armor, behind the banners, and behind the legends, the medieval knight was not only a symbol of war or honor, he was also a human being, shaped by intense psychological pressure. To understand knighthood fully, history cannot stop at battles and kingdoms. It must also enter the mind of the warrior. From the earliest stages of training, a future knight was conditioned into a very specific worldview. As a page, he learned obedience before understanding. As a squire, he learned discipline before independence. By the time he reached knighthood, his identity was already deeply structured around hierarchy, duty, and controlled violence. This process created a powerful psychological framework. Loyalty was not just encouraged, it was internalized as identity. To serve one's lord was not only a duty, but a reflection of personal worth. To break that loyalty was not just betrayal of a system, but a fracture of self. This is one of the hidden foundations of medieval knighthood. It was as much psychological construction as it was military function. Fear also played a complex role. Not only fear of death on the battlefield, but fear of dishonor, fear of losing status, fear of failing expectations placed by family, lord, and faith. In many cases, a knight's greatest pressure was not the enemy in front of him, but the judgment of the world he belonged to. Even concepts like courage were not simple emotional states. They were trained responses reinforced by culture, ritual, and repetition. A knight did not merely feel brave. He was expected to perform bravery as part of his identity. But this constant expectation created internal tension, because no system that demands continuous courage can fully eliminate fear. It can only reshape how fear is expressed. This psychological reality becomes even more complex when considering the nature of medieval warfare itself. Battles were often chaotic, loud, and disorienting. Communication was limited, visibility could be poor. The difference between victory and collapse could happen in moments of confusion rather than structured decision-making. In such conditions, knights relied heavily on training and group cohesion. But even cohesion had limits when faced with exhaustion, injury, or overwhelming opposition. Over time, repeated exposure to violence could lead to emotional numbness, detachment, or a hardened acceptance of brutality as normal reality. While medieval sources do not describe psychology in modern terms, the patterns of behavior in prolonged warfare strongly suggest that knights were not immune to the psychological cost of violence. This cost is often hidden beneath narratives of honor and glory. But it remains an essential part of the story. As knighthood evolved, especially in its later stages, another psychological shift occurred: identity fragmentation. When knights were absorbed into early modern armies or reduced to symbolic court roles, their original identity system began to dissolve. A knight who no longer fought in the traditional sense had to reinterpret his own purpose. Was he still a warrior, a noble, a servant of tradition, or simply part of a changing political system? This uncertainty created a transitional identity crisis across many noble families and military traditions. Even institutions that once provided absolute structure, such as the Knights Templar, eventually became part of historical memory rather than living systems of identity. Their legacy, whether interpreted as disciplined military order or as cultural mystery, continued to influence imagination long after their physical presence disappeared. But psychologically, their disappearance also symbolizes something larger: the collapse of a fully unified warrior identity in Europe. As centralized states grew stronger and warfare became more institutional, the individual warrior lost some of his previous autonomy. Decisions were increasingly made by systems, not single fighters. This shift reduced the psychological role of personal honor in determining the outcome of war. In earlier medieval structures, a knight could believe his personal courage directly influenced the fate of battles. In later systems, success depended more on coordination, resources, and collective organization. This transition changes not only warfare, but the meaning of participation in it. And this is where the human cost becomes most visible, not only in physical terms, but in existential ones. What does it mean for a warrior identity to lose its central function? What happens when a lifetime of training becomes less relevant to the world it was designed for? These questions do not have simple answers, but they are central to understanding the emotional dimension of knighthood's decline, because beneath all the armor and history, the knight represents a deeper human struggle, the attempt to find stability in systems that are constantly changing. He is trained to be certain in a world that is uncertain. He is expected to be loyal in a world where loyalty shifts. He is expected to be honorable in systems where survival often demands compromise. This contradiction is not unique to medieval knights. It is a recurring pattern in human history, but the knight expresses it in one of its clearest historical forms. And this is why the knight continues to matter even after his age has ended. Not because he was perfect, but because he was human within a structure that demanded more than humanity could always consistently provide. In the end, the psychology of knighthood reveals the final truth. Beneath the legend, the knight was not only shaped by war, he was shaped by expectation. An expectation once internalized becomes a force as powerful as any weapon on the battlefield. As medieval knighthood evolved through centuries of war, politics, and transformation, one of its most defining dimensions was the constant tension between religion and power. The knight was never only a soldier and never only a noble. He existed at the intersection of spiritual belief and political necessity, two forces that often supported each other but just as often conflicted. In theory, the knight was shaped by religious ideals: protection of the weak, justice in warfare, loyalty grounded in moral order. The church provided rituals, blessings, and a framework that gave war a sense of sacred meaning. Before battle, knights prayed. Before campaigns, they sought divine approval. In their own cultural understanding, they were not merely fighting for land or kings, they were participating in a moral universe governed by higher authority. But in practice, the relationship between religion and power was far more complex. Kings and nobles often used religious language to justify political expansion. Wars could be framed as righteous even when driven by territorial ambition,
or dynastic rivalry.
This did not necessarily negate the sincerity of belief among individual knights, but it did create a layered system where spiritual justification and political motivation coexisted, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. This duality became one of the defining features of knighthood.
And it also became one of its deepest contradictions, because a knight was expected to embody both obedience to earthly authority and alignment with divine moral order. When those two forces aligned, knighthood felt unified and purposeful. When they diverged, the knight was placed in an internal conflict that had no simple resolution. This tension is visible throughout medieval history, especially during major conflicts where loyalty, faith, and political interest did not always point in the same direction. Over time, as centralized states grew stronger and religious authority became more institutionally separated from military execution, this fusion of sacred and political identity began to weaken. Warfare became increasingly state-driven rather than spiritually framed.
The knight's role as a divinely sanctioned warrior gradually transitioned into a more secular military function. Yet the symbolic memory of that earlier unity did not disappear. Instead, it evolved into cultural archetype. The knight became more than a historical figure. He became a symbolic structure through which societies expressed ideas about morality, duty, and conflict. In this symbolic form, he is no longer bound by the specific conditions of medieval Europe. He can appear in different eras, cultures, and narratives, always carrying the same core thematic weight: the struggle to maintain integrity within systems of power. This is why the knight remains such a powerful figure even in modern imagination. He represents a universal human archetype, the individual who must act within forces larger than himself, while still attempting to preserve personal meaning and ethical consistency. In literature and philosophy, this archetype can take many forms. It can appear as a literal armored warrior, or as a metaphorical figure, representing moral resistance, loyalty under pressure, or disciplined action in chaotic environments. But the core structure remains consistent: a person navigating conflict between internal values and external demands. Even historical reinterpretations of knightly institutions such as the Knights Templar contribute to this symbolic evolution. Their story, combining religious mission, military structure, political influence, and eventual destruction, has become part of a broader cultural language used to explore themes of power, secrecy, trust, and downfall. Whether viewed strictly historically or through symbolic interpretation, they remain embedded in the narrative imagination of knighthood. But the deeper significance of knighthood lies not in any single order or era. It lies in its adaptability as a symbol. Few historical roles carry such a long symbolic afterlife. The knight continues to appear in modern storytelling not because society still needs armored cavalry, but because society still needs frameworks to explore ethical struggle under pressure. In that sense, the knight is less a figure of the past and more a tool for understanding the present. He reflects the ongoing human challenge of balancing power and morality, of acting with courage in uncertain systems, of maintaining identity in environments that constantly shift. And this is where the philosophical meaning of knighthood becomes clear. The knight is not defined by armor, he is defined by tension. Tension between loyalty and independence. Tension between violence and restraint. tension between duty and conscience. When those tensions disappear, the knight ceases to exist as a meaningful concept. But as long as those tensions remain part of human life, the knight continues to reappear, reshaped, reinterpreted, but never fully gone. This is the final reason why knighthood persists across time, not because it represents a perfect ideal, but because it represents an unresolved question. And unresolved questions do not end. They evolve. As the long arc of knighthood stretches beyond its historical boundaries, something unusual happens. The knight stops belonging to a specific era altogether. He begins to exist outside the strict limits of time, carried forward not by armies or institutions, but by memory itself. This transformation is not sudden. It is gradual, almost invisible at first. As centuries pass after the decline of real knightly warfare, the knight becomes less a living participant in history and more a layered cultural presence. He is remembered, retold, reinterpreted, and reshaped again and again. Each generation adding its own meaning. Each era filtering him through its own values. In this process, the knight becomes something more durable than the systems that created him. He becomes cultural immortality. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that even though the armored warrior disappears from real battlefields, his image continues to survive in literature, art, folklore, and later mass media. He is no longer bound to feudal Europe or to the specific political and military conditions that produced him. Instead, he becomes a flexible symbol that can be inserted into different narratives without losing his recognizable identity. A knight can represent honor in one story, tragedy in another, rebellion in a third. He can be idealized, criticized, deconstructed, or romanticized. Yet across all these versions, something remains constant. The presence of structured moral struggle within a world shaped by conflict. This is the core of his immortality. Unlike many historical roles that fade completely once their practical function ends, knighthood survives because it is not only functional, it is interpretive. It can be reshaped without being destroyed, because its foundation is symbolic rather than purely material. Even historical knightly institutions, such as the Knights Templar, continue to exist in cultural imagination long after their physical dissolution. Their historical reality is documented, but their symbolic presence expands beyond documentation into interpretation, mystery, and narrative exploration. They become part of a larger storytelling ecosystem where history and imagination overlap, and this overlap is crucial because it shows that knighthood does not survive as a fixed truth. It survives as a living reinterpretation. Each generation reconstructs the knight based on its own understanding of values and conflict. In times that emphasize order and stability, the knight becomes a guardian of structure. In times that emphasize individuality and moral questioning, he becomes a conflicted ethical agent. In times that emphasize uncertainty, he becomes a symbol of endurance under pressure. This adaptability is what makes him timeless. But there is another layer to this immortality: emotional memory. The knight does not survive only because he is studied or represented. He survives because he is felt. The image of a solitary armored figure facing overwhelming odds carries emotional weight that transcends historical accuracy. It speaks to human experiences of struggle, responsibility, and moral tension in a way that remains recognizable across centuries. This emotional resonance is why the knight continues to appear even in contexts far removed from medieval warfare. He is not just a historical figure being preserved, he is a symbolic language being reused. And like all powerful symbolic languages, he evolves with each use. In modern storytelling, the knight can be reconstructed as realistic, showing the brutality and complexity of medieval life. Or he can be transformed into a mythic ideal, representing pure courage or unwavering loyalty. Both interpretations are valid within their own narrative frameworks because the knight is no longer owned by history alone. He belongs to imagination as much as he belongs to record. This dual ownership is what creates his lasting cultural power. Because history provides the foundation, but imagination provides continuity. And together they allow the knight to exist in a state of ongoing transformation rather than final conclusion. This is why the knight feels unfinished, even after centuries. He is not a closed chapter. He is an open symbol. And in that openness lies his true endurance. As the saga moves toward its final conclusion, one truth becomes clear. The knight was never just a man in armor, riding through medieval battlefields. He was a structure of meaning built around conflict, duty, and moral tension. When the armor disappeared, the structure remained. When the battlefield changed, the structure adapted. And when history moved forward, the structure entered memory. That is how knighthood achieves what can be called cultural immortality, not by remaining physically present, but by continuing to be reinterpreted wherever human beings try to understand the relationship between power and morality. And so, even as we approach the final closure of this entire saga, the knight is not ending. He is continuing, just in a different form. A form made of story, symbol, and memory that refuses to disappear. As the full arc of knighthood is brought into one final frame, everything that once felt separate begins to converge. History, myth, psychology, warfare, religion, and imagination no longer appear as isolated layers. Instead, they collapse into a single integrated structure of meaning. Complex, contradictory, and inseparable. This is the final synthesis of the knight. To understand it, one must hold two truths at the same time, even if they resist each other. The first truth is historical. The knight was a product of necessity. He emerged in a fragmented medieval world where centralized authority was weak, and local power structures depended on armored elites to enforce stability. He was trained, maintained, and deployed within systems of feudal obligation, religious influence, and constant military pressure. His existence was practical. He fought wars that were real, not symbolic. He served rulers who were human, not idealized. He operated within conflicts driven by land, inheritance, politics, and survival. And like all participants in history, he was shaped by the limitations of his time. The second truth is symbolic. The knight became something far larger than his historical function. Over centuries, he was reinterpreted into a moral structure representing courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and ethical tension under pressure. He became a narrative device through which societies explored questions of honor, violence, authority, and identity. He became an idea. And these two truths do not cancel each other. They coexist, but they also conflict. Because the historical knight is fragmented, inconsistent, and shaped by contradiction, while the symbolic knight is structured, idealized, and emotionally coherent. One reflects the instability of real life. The other reflects the human need for meaning. This contradiction is not a flaw in understanding knighthood. It is the essence of knighthood itself. Every major theme of the knight contains this duality. Honor exists, but not uniformly. Loyalty exists, but within competing systems. Violence is structured, but also chaotic. Faith is present, but intertwined with political interest. Courage is real, but always tested by fear and survival. Even knightly institutions such as the Knights Templar reflect this dual structure. Historically, they were disciplined military, religious organizations embedded in the politics and warfare of their time. Culturally, they became symbols of mystery, power, downfall, and enduring speculation. Both interpretations arise from the same source, yet they diverge into different forms of meaning. This divergence is not accidental. It reveals something fundamental about how human societies process the past. History alone records what happened, but culture decides what it means. And knighthood exists precisely at the intersection of these two processes. As the knight transitions from reality into memory, he undergoes what can be described as structural compression. The complexity of lived medieval warfare is gradually simplified into narrative archetypes. The contradictions of real historical actors are reduced into symbolic roles that are easier to transmit across generations. This is not distortion in a negative sense. It is transformation. Because without transformation, memory cannot survive across time. But transformation always involves loss as well as preservation. What is lost is the full unpredictability of historical life, the ambiguity, the inconsistency, the fragmented motivations of individuals operating under pressure. What is preserved is emotional clarity, the sense of meaning,